Okay, let's spend a few minutes now going through a rehash of some terminology. Um, we all got to speak the same language, and when we don't, we got problems. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's make sure we know what the difference is between a threat and an attack, for example. Right? A threat is some type of category of thing, whether object, person, or something, that is a potential risk. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. It means it may happen. Right? Versus an attack, where when we talk about an attack, we talk about some type of action that could make some type of unwanted, undesired change, damage, modification, what have you, to an asset. Asset is whatever the organization needs to do its business. Whether we're talking data, whether we're talking hardware, software, people, systems, processes, those are all considered assets. So subject to object, you get the idea here. Okay, direct versus indirect. Okay, again, nothing really new here that we need to touch on. I don't think. Although sometimes people do get subject of and object of backwards. So just go through and just flat out memorize that, and you'll be good to go. So a threat agent is a specific instance of a generalized threat to a system. Vulnerabilities. Now, we're seeing a lot of discussion about vulnerabilities and the so-called 0 days or O-day vulnerabilities, right? When we talk about a vulnerability in this context, we're talking about a weakness or a soft point in some type of system or control or process that can be taken advantage of using an exploit. Okay, and so an exploit is a series of steps or processes, things that attackers will execute against a system with a known vulnerability. Now the tricky part here, especially here in the last few years, is that we're seeing a lot more discussion being placed on how do we go about revealing or disclosing vulnerabilities when we find them as researchers. And that's a whole nother topic for another day. And then a whole nother separate issue here would be, what about the so-called 0 days or O days? And those are nothing more than vulnerabilities that have been found by researchers that have not yet been made public. And so the question is, well, how do you make them public, right? Which ties into the then, how do we disclose these vulnerabilities? Do we hit the marketplace with them as soon as we find them? Do we give the vendors time to run them down? Do we sell them for cash? On and on and on and on. So lots of different ways to think about vulnerabilities. And again, all that's outside the scope of this particular course, but these are some things that as professionals we need to think about. Controls, safeguards, countermeasures, they're all the same thing, right? Something you put in place to try and lessen the risk to the assets that you've got to protect. So risk, it's managing, identifying, quantifying risk is a lot of times black art and voodoo. We look at this concept of risk management and risk analysis, and it is a huge part of what we do with the enterprise every day, because organizations they need to understand the degree to which they are exposed. And this is where, again, going back to previous conversations I've had about us as security professionals taking issue with or feeling personally affronted when an organization that we work for doesn't seem to understand the risk or doesn't care about the risk, we think, to the appropriate level. Understand that when we talk about risk, it's all about lowering the cost for an organization of a successful incident or breach or whatever the case may be, balanced against how much will it cost an organization to put that control or process in place to lessen that risk. And so it's a math equation at the end of the day, right? There are lots of different frameworks that are out there for us to use to try and help us manage and assess risk. But at the end of the day, it's a math equation, and we need to understand that. Too often, we seem to, in our field of work, we seem to take things personally when an organization says to you, okay, thanks for the assessment, we understand it, we're just going to accept it, we're not going to deal with it. That's where you draw the line and say, okay, thank you very much, and you move on. But there are too many people who will take it personally and then say, well, this is a bad organization, I don't want to work for it. How can you not listen to what I'm saying? We have to lock this asset down. When at the end of the day, our job is to inform senior management about these problems, about the potential of an incident occurring, of a compromise happening, versus what's it going to cost to put controls in place to help lessen the chance of this happening, right? We never take the risk down to zero. It's just not a reality. And so that's where we go. That's where we get into the math behind risk management. And it's not personal, but there are too many of us who take it personally. And there have been a lot of discussions. A lot of my friends out in the field, are talking about the concept of security burnout, where we work so hard, and we find these things and we try and make the organization what we think is more secure, and it seems like senior management isn't involved, doesn't get invested, and so we work ourselves into the ground to the point where we hate our jobs, and that's not good. So understanding risk management and our role in playing with that within the organization. I mean, for me, that's one of the big problems that I think some of our recent graduates from the program have faced. They walk out thinking, yes, I'm ready to take on the world, and yes, I'm going to go hard and protect an organization. And no, really, your job is to just inform, work within the scope of your authority, whatever position you've been hired at, and to make sure that they are aware of potential problems and potential ways to go about trying to minimize the possibility of those problems happening. But at the end of the day, managers make decisions, and you've got to move on. Don't hold on too tight to it, because it will burn you out in the long run. I wouldn't wish that for anybody. So, when we talk about risk from a pure theoretical sense, there are two states of risk. There's pre-control risk, and then there's post-control risk. Otherwise known as the post-control risk is known as the residual risk, or what's left over after we have put whatever control or countermeasures into place to try and lessen the risk. So we could see pre-control risk of 50%, and then once we put the control in place, maybe we're down to 20 or 10%. So that's really what we're talking about here in that context. So what are the ways that organizations can go about managing risk and dealing with risk? The avoidance, in other words, just ignoring it, is an approach that is actually taken by a great deal of organizations. Sometimes, they're lucky that it works, but it's not because of any proactive professional steps that they've taken to deal with that. I liken this to, basically Russian roulette. You put a bullet in a gun, you put the gun to your head, you pull the trigger, right? Maybe you get shot, maybe you don't. But this really isn't risk management at all, in my estimation. This is just risk oblivion. Insuring, whether we do it internally or externally, risk transfer is known as external insurance, internal insurance, self-insurance, where we've decided that we can just take the hit financially if this risk actually comes to fruition. So moving on here. Now, the concept, and we've talked about this in all the courses I'm sure that you've taken, the concept of security in depth. And even this concept is debated frequently amongst some of my friends and colleagues out in the field. There are some who feel that defense in depth, in other words, putting multiple types of defensive controls in place within the organization is a waste of time. And so they feel like we don't really need to do that. What we really need to do is go towards a more asset-based protection, and that would entail the idea of identifying the critical assets to the organization, putting them, ranking them in terms of degrees of criticality to protect, and then focusing your time and efforts trying to protect those particular assets, as opposed to the idea of trying to protect the entire network, building multiple controls into place throughout your organization's computing environment. And there are pros and cons for both approaches. But the onion approach, the defense in depth, is still very popular today. And so, within the context of this course, 4200 perimeter defense, we start to think about, okay, I've got to identify where my network ends and the network that we connect to begins, for example. And so we start looking at ingress and egress points at the edge of our network. And so when we talk about edge protection devices, in this context, we're thinking about firewalls that are placed at the edges of entry and exit for our network, and it could be one point or it could be several points. And so those are the things that we start to think about in terms of trying to, if we want to go this defense in depth or layering approach, then we start identifying from the outside in, or I've seen some people take it from the inside out, but most times the focus begins from the outside in, and identifying those points of ingress and egress between our network and the upstream network, partner network, whoever it is that we're connected with, and starting to work your way in. And a lot of times organizations will do that. They will harden the perimeter, they'll harden the edge, and then think that they're done. And so the analogy that I've heard used time and time again is that when we look at networks like this, we're looking at a piece of candy with the hard shell outside, with the soft gooey inside. And the soft gooey inside is that way because too often organizations will start at the edge and then not work their way in. And so, hardening at the edge is good, but the reality is with modern networking today and the prevalent use of either VPNs to connect into the network or the concept of BYOD, bring your own device, it's really tough determining where your network ends and where another network begins, especially with devices that cross back and forth between separate networks. In the traditional sense, before remote connectivity was a possibility and BYOD was a possibility, organizations could fairly well have a fairly good hand on where their assets were within an organization because they're all physically connected. Now we're talking about concerns with wireless networks. Now we're talking about being able to connect in remotely with a computer that may never actually physically enter the network, the interior of the network. It just attaches logically from the outside, right? So then we start having concerns about how do we protect and harden those devices so that they present less of a risk to us at the edge. And BYOD, we can bring that in, and most times we're talking about Wi-Fi connectivity, but a lot of times we're looking at devices that will actually physically cable into our existing network inside the perimeter. Dealing with all of these things is a challenge, and so that's why the concept of a security perimeter, for theoretical purposes, is good to talk about, but in actuality, we're now in a day and age where the perimeter is almost impossible to define and protect for large-scale organizations. So that ought to keep you up at night a little bit. So a couple of graphics here. And this is a very simplified image. Again, we see here in the middle with the buffer DMZ, we're assuming a single point of ingress and egress on our network from the outside to the inside. And so what do we expect that device at the edge to do? Well, at a minimum, you're looking at packet filtering, probably most likely looking at some type of address translation, whether in this case, if it's a single point of ingress and egress to the network, then we're probably talking about a single public-facing IP address, which means we would end up going with port address translation, or PAT. And so again, the idea is, in theory, all network traffic travels in and out of this choke point right here, and so we know that we can focus a lot of efforts here. And then we'll spend more time looking at this type of network setup in future discussions. Now we're looking here at the idea of, if we compare that against this device or this environment here, really we don't have any details at all on the trusted inside network. Now we're looking a little deeper here, and now when we start thinking about layering in protections, for example, we're looking at, as you can see placed here, a host-based IDS where we're monitoring a single system. Maybe we're talking about network-based IDS. Maybe we're talking about firewalls, software-based firewalls on the individual systems here in question, whether we're talking employee workstations, maybe these are servers, what have you. When we start looking inside, and even in the DMZ here, we're seeing in this case this could be physically 3 separate devices, or this could be logically 3 separate devices that all reside in a single piece of hardware, where we've got internal filtering happening on the internal NIC. In this case, we've got a dual-homed or dual NIC host, where we've got 2 physical network devices. One is attached to the upstream service provider or partner network, whoever it is we're communicating with, and then the other NIC is there solely to service the internal network. And so they're going to have completely different IP addresses, most likely in this case. We're probably in this case looking at an environment where everything to the right, from the internal filtering router on in, the NIC that device is attached to is probably looking at a private Class C address. We're probably doing some address translation there in the host. And so, and a different set of packet filtering rules are built into each side of that device, where we look at it as a funnel, if you will, where we're going to allow a large amount of traffic in through the external, believe it or not, and then as traffic starts to come in or go through the funnel, we start to tighten it down. And so our rule set for the external router or external device will be fairly wide open. We may be tempted to, and actually this will happen a lot of times, we're going to allow a great deal of traffic in the front door, but then as we start getting closer and closer to our trusted network, we're going to start being a lot more discriminating in terms of what we're letting through from the outside world. So I think that's that's about all I've got for now for this portion of our conversation. Thank you very much for your time.